Well, good morning, everybody. This morning, our first reading comes from Jonah. And we all know the story of Jonah, don't we? We know part of the story of Jonah. We know the story of Jonah being swallowed by a whale. But believe it or not, there's more in the book of the prophet Jonah than him getting swallowed by the whale. There's the events leading up to that and the events that followed that. And we hear the events immediately following that in this first reading. If you've never read the book of the prophet Jonah, it's actually very, very small, only 4 quick chapters. But if you haven't read it, I invite you to take some time to read it. And apparently you're going to have lots of time on Tuesday. So get yourself a candle and a Bible, make sure it's close by so you can spend some time reading about Jonah. Basically what happens is Jonah receives a call from God. Go to Nineveh and preach the message I give you, which we heard today. Jonah, who in many ways is an example of life in 2015, just doesn't ignore this call from God, but he seeks to run away from this call. And he goes to distant lands. He eventually gets himself into a boat and discovers, much to his chagrin, that you really can't run away from God who created the world, is all-powerful and all-knowing. Long story short, he gets thrown overboard and gets eaten by a giant fish, not a whale, actually. The scriptures never say whale. It's a giant fish. Apparently, there wasn't much to do in the belly of a giant fish, so it gave him a lot of time to think. And as a result of his thinking, he repents from running away from God. It's actually a very beautiful, I think it's in chapter 2, very beautiful psalm of praise to God for his mercy and forgiveness. Out of distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. God forgives him. The fish spits him up, and we go into today's story, where God once again calls Jonah to this mission, to this task of preaching to the people of Nineveh. And what happens? Jonah is incredibly successful. Just one day, the entire city repents. In fact, what we don't hear in the little bit of verses we hear today is the people saying, if we not only repent, but we show contrition, maybe God will have mercy on us. And in fact, as we heard at the end of the story today, a little selection, God indeed showed mercy and compassion to the people of Nineveh and didn't destroy the city of Nineveh. Jonah's story doesn't end there. At this point, he has another tantrum, and he runs away once again. I don't know how he thought it'd be different the second time, but he did it a second time. He runs away. He runs away because we begin to get an insight as to what led Jonah to accept this mission. It wasn't really so I can be an instrument of God, but perhaps he took on this mission the second time for fear that something bigger than the fish would come after him if he ignored God once again. So he goes out to proclaim once again, as we heard in the reading today, and he gets disappointed that the city wasn't destroyed. Jonah wanted to see fireworks. He wanted to see God's wrath inflicted on this people. And it didn't happen. And he tantrums and runs away into the desert. Conversation takes place, and God basically states or asks, should I not be concerned over the great city of Nineveh? Telling Jonah that he was sent not to condemn, not to judge, but he was sent on a mission of mercy and compassion. It was his role to simply invite others to experience what he himself experienced, that is, God's love, mercy, and compassion. Well, thousands of years after this story of Jonah and 2,000 years after the call of the disciples, the Lord still calls his people. He still calls each of us to basically the same mission, not just in terms of vocations in life, but within our vocations, in our day-to-day lives. A mission not to condemn or to judge or to threaten, but to invite. To invite others to experience God's love, God's mercy, in God's compassion. To be authentic to this mission, we need to hear the Lord's invitation ourselves. We need to repent, to open ourselves to his compassion and mercy, and to receive his forgiveness. That way we don't become obstacles that prevents others from hearing God's call and God's invitation.